So as we get into the question about the so-called overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1893, yeah, just to reflect, remember we can talk about the first half of the overthrow happening in 1897 with the so-called bayonet constitution being illegally imposed upon Kalakaua, and then later into the time of Lili'uokalani. So again, I'm just going to repeat a lot of the things that you should already get from the films like Pa'akeaupuni and An Act of War, and also the readings, the NEA readings, and others, including the Apology Bill. But the main highlights, of course, in 1897, the Bayonet Constitution sets up what happens in 1893. In 1893, by this point, uh, there is a very strong conspiracy led by John L. Stevens, who's the minister of for the United States government in the Hawaiian Kingdom. He's the diplomatic representative, and he conspires with many of those of the so-called Committee of Safety, the group of 13, to self-proclaim themselves the new so-called government of the Hawaiian Kingdom, and they call themselves the provisional government. Again, the word provisional, like temporary government, and why they call it the provisional government. The whole intention is for the provisional government to annex, to cede the Hawaiian Kingdom into the United States. Now, why you got to think about what's the purpose of it? Well, one, of course, is the political power they would give them, those so-called elites, to control Hawaii and Hawaii's resources through the support and help of the United States military, which is already at that point making strong gestures to take Pearl Harbor and so forth. Um, there's also a kind of around the world. If you look at historically, you got to put this in context, right? In 1883, Africa is divided amongst the European powers. Places like South Africa, you have India, you have uh, Indonesia, run by the Dutch. So you see so-called classic colonialism, and of course, Africa is being totally exploited for its resources and for its labor. And throughout the world, this idea of the European should run and control the world is something that's bleeding itself even into the Hawaiian Kingdom. This idea that it should be run by so-called white elite Europeans and Americans. And so, with this conspiracy, um, also to yield Pearl Harbor and again, you kind of got to put in context. The United States is already beginning this idea of becoming this imperial nation, yeah, to expand its borders beyond the reaches of the continental United States. So 1893, we have what's called the Act of War, and again, you can watch the film. These are the words used by the United States President Grover Cleveland, addresses to Congress on December of 1893, when he describes the actual United States presence in Hawaii, for them to explain why they landed troops. Was basically the idea of an act of war. In other words, illegal. It's not founded on any democratic principles. Um, it There was no justification for the United States landing troops in a foreign country. Again, it would be no different the United States landing troops in France, or United States landing troops in Spain, or United States coming to land troops in any other foreign country without it aligning with so-called international law at that time, which of course would be the idea of a military occupation of Honolulu. So even the language of military occupation in Honolulu is what Cleveland describes the United States presence in Hawaii. So when we talk about Hawaii being under a military occupation by U.S. forces, these are the exact words of the U.S. president. Yeah, so these are not radical Hawaiians making up these kinds of words today. These are the actual words of the president describing the U.S. military and their presence in Hawaii at that time. Now, a very important point you have to look at and really discern. Again, you can look at whether from the various videos we have, readings, but also the apology bill, is the statement that was submitted on proclaimed on January 17th, 1893. That's why a lot of time that's the actual date of we talk about the so-called overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom government. So some things to kind of remember as we go through readings is when we think about overthrow, what is overthrown potentially could be the government, but the country cannot be overthrown. And in other words, if you look at examples of look at Iraq today, right? Look at Afghanistan. The United States may occupy that country militarily for a period of time, again for a period of time, but there's really no mechanism for the United States now to take. In other words, Iraq couldn't become the 51st state of the United States without the express consent and through some kind of treaty, what's called a treaty of annexation, a treaty of cession. And this in lies the issue for Hawaii. So let's look at Lili Okalani's actual statement. This is her actual statement that we have to look at. There's a lot of mythologies. Again, going to the idea of mythologies become expressed as political truth, when in fact, that's not based at all. Yeah, let's look at the actual facts. So here's Lili'u's statement. I, Lili'u Okalani, by the grace of God and under the Constitution of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Again, to understand, she is restrained under the Constitution, which dictates her powers, right? So she's not an absolute monarch. She doesn't have the queen power to do whatever she wants. She is confined to the powers of the Constitution. Do hereby solemnly protest against any and all acts done against myself and the constitutional government of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Right? So she's making an official protest saying, hey, this is illegal. You don't have any rights to do what you're doing here under international law. And when you read her other writings, it's very clear that she was very astute and understood international law perfectly. And this is why this statement, in many ways, locks in the Hawaiian Kingdom's argument on the illegality and unlawfulness of the United States presence in Hawaii. So again, she's reminding this is it's constitutional, right? It's a constitutional form by certain persons claiming to have established a provisional government. Again, it doesn't mean that we're ever recognized. It's just claiming that they have. Now, the United States themselves come with this idea of what's called the consent of the governed, right? The governed have to give their consent to be governed. Where does, in fact, this so-called what becomes a puppet government, they're a provisional government, where did they get the authority from? And that's the question. What legal means, if I ask the question, what is the legality of the authority? What is it based on? Well, nothing. There's nothing on the international law, constitutional law that would show that they actually had any lawful right to do what they did. And this is the question, right? If it's lawful, if it was legal, what are you pointing at? What is the actual law you're looking at? And you won't find any. So again, the idea of a provisional government for the kingdom, right? In power. Quote, this is the actual quote, that I yield, again, I, her, yield, and again, what does the word yield mean, right? She's gonna stop. She's gonna, gonna look at the power, the superior force of the United States. Now, it's very clear when the United States landed troops on January 16th, 1893, yeah, over 187 Marines of the most technologically advanced military warship of its time just happened to be in Pearl Harbor. Yeah, happened to be, sorry, not Pearl Harbor, but Honolulu Harbor at that time. They land, they set up their Gatling guns and their firepower directly across of the palace, supposedly to protect American lives and what they owned in Hawaii at that time. But again, it's very clear that they were pointing their guns at the Queen and as an act of war. So again, she tells you, "I yield to the superior force," meaning their guns pointing. Right? This is not yielding because you giving free consent. Yeah, who's minister, plenipotentiary, John L. Stevens, again, so make it clear who is responsible, has caused U.S. troops to be landed, right? This U.S. is interfering in the sovereignty of another country. Again, this is highly illegal even under international law, right? The United States kind of go in and land troops and support one faction of Japan against the government. Again, there's no legality to that, but it's exactly what happens in Hawaii, and declared that he would support the provisional government. So they're making it clear that John L. Stevens, a representative, a legal representative of the United States, for his wrongdoing. The second part, now to avoid any collision of armed forces. So she's telling you the why, right? She doesn't want to get into a school again. Why? Because she has the upper hand legally. Yeah, Queen Lili Oakland understood that what the United States was doing had no authority. There's no legal authority for them to do what they did. So to avoid collision of armed forces and perhaps the loss of life. So she's saying, right, she's going to rely on law. She's going to rely on international law, not on the right of the gun. I do this under protest. And again, protest, not a free will, not a consent. And impelled, again, what's the word impelled by said force? Yeah, impelled. You're being forced to do this. This is not a free consent. Yield my authority. Now, that's a real important statement. What does she give? My authority. That's it. That's it. The question is, what is my authority? Her authority, of course, was part of the executive branch of the Hawaiian Kingdom government as the so-called queen, as the monarch, which is limited by the Constitution. Yeah. So in other words, what is she giving up? Did she give up the country? No. Does she give up the lands? Nope. Does she give the whole country away? Nope. What does she yield? Her authority. That's it. That's the executive branch. And you got to understand a little bit about international law at this time, that a country can occupy a foreign state. And during that military occupation, what happens? And for example, you can just look at the United States occupying Iraq. It takes control of the governance, the executive, but they are required. I want you to listen carefully. They are required under international law not to enforce their own colonial laws in the other country, but in fact, they're required as an occupation to enforce the laws of the occupied nation state. In other words, if the United States is going to occupy militarily Hawaii, their role, in fact, is to execute the laws of what? Not of America, but of the Hawaiian Kingdom. This is very clear under international law. And you're going to see this later on. You're going to see it come out in some of the things we're going to look at. Yeah. I do this under protest and impelled by said force, yield my authority. Again, now the most important, I think, is this statement here. Until such time. Now, what does it mean, until such time? In other words, when she yielded her authority, was it forever? No. It was temporarily, it's provisional. Her yielding of her executive branch, not the Hawaiian Kingdom government, not the legislative branch, not the people, not the citizenship, not the lands. Her authority was temporary until such time. And she gives the way in which it will be rectified. Yeah, as the government of the United States, right, the U.S. government shall, upon facts being presented to it, right, undo the actions of its representatives, which is John L. Stevens, and reinstate me. So she gives you the answer. In other words, she's not asked. She didn't say, "Give me back my country, give me back the lands." What she says is, "Reinstate me in the authority which I claim as the sovereign, as the constitutional sovereign." In other words, her remedy is all that she gave up. All she gave up was her authority as the executive branch. And then until such time, which is temporarily, when it's fixed, then when you guys find out the truth, you reinstate me. You put me back in this authority. This is very important because the mythology is, oh, she surrendered. Well, you see the word surrender here? No. Or she gave up all the Hawaiian Kingdom lands. Does she say any of that yet? No. Or the citizenship. And so there's a lot of mythology about exactly what happened on January 17th. My point is, it's all right here. Yeah, you can actually read it for yourself. Not the mythology, not opinions, but actual facts. So in 1893, the so-called provisional government, who, as you can see in the film and other things, right, who self-appoint themselves and make a declaration, and with the support and help of the United States military, proclaim themselves a provisional government with the key as for the key purpose is to yield Hawaii, to surrender Hawaii, to cede Hawaii, to be annexed by the United States. That's their main purpose. So they attempt, right? They go. You have any doubts that Hawaii is under military occupation? That's Iolani Palace. Contingency goes and they try to secure Hawaii being annexed by the United States. Grover Cleveland sends Congressman Blount, who does a Blount report in Hawaii, 400-page investigation, and they come back and says, "Hey, there's nothing legal about what happens in Hawaii. There's no legal authorities, no way really legally for the United States to take Hawaii." And that's in the Blount report. And so this is why Cleveland, the attempted annexation in 1893, he pulls that treaty. He says, "You can't have this. This is illegal. We don't have the consent. There's nothing legal about what occurred." And he says that they're what he calls a provisional government. And he says they're neither de jure or de jure, meaning they're neither legally, lawfully, or de facto, in fact, rule Hawaii. And the only reason why they are still in power, in fact, had to do with the role of the United States military in Hawaii at this point. So, this language of Hawaii being under U.S. military occupation, again, this comes from the United States themselves. This is their excuse to explain what they're doing in Hawaii at this time. Yeah, so when you hear Hawaiians today talk about the military occupation, again, we're only repeating exactly. The question is, when did the military occupation end? And if ended, when and how? What are the legal mechanisms? Well, the provisional government, because they're stalled and they're not able to move through with Cleveland's push in Congress for because of the illegality of the overthrow. Now they transform themselves in 1894. They go from being the provisional government and they create a new country, a new government called the Republic of Hawaii. And be mindful, the Republic of Hawaii, you have Dole as its first president. They have a constitutional convention. They write up a new constitution, and they really only had between 3 and 4 thousand so-called citizens. I repeat, only between 3 and 4 thousand citizens became citizens of the Republic of Hawaii. Remember that key element. Well, and there's a couple of attempts. There's actually in 1895. There's an attempt to restore the Queen and so forth under Wilcox and so and but an important historical event, 1897. Grover Cleveland goes out of office, and there's a lot of stuff in between. I don't have time to go through all of that stuff, but part of it also is the United States is trying to negotiate to Gresham and some other people, the Secretary of State, with the Hawaiian Kingdom to correct the situation. Grover Cleveland at this time is kind of a lame duck president. There's a lot of politics going. In fact, I would say what you see going on in the United States today, right, between the so-called Republicans and Democrats, really kind of had a very similar time going on in the United States in 1897. The United States was going through this kind of identity crisis of would they be a republic and follow law and order, or would they become an empire and so forth and expand to take other lands. And so Hawaii really is the first so-called extraterritorial, if you're going to use it that way. I mean, it's outside of what you would think of being the so-called mainland 48 states, continent United States that is taken. And that's why it's such an important event, because in Congress is a huge debate that's going on within Congress. There's a faction, a very pro-military faction that are saying, okay, we know it's not legal, but let's just take Hawaii anyway, as they're getting prepared for what becomes a Spanish-American War. Yeah, and yeah, you see that in your readings. But at the same time, uh, there's multiple attempts to restore the Hawaiian Kingdom. There's a negotiations, in fact, what goes on, uh, which there was an agreement between the Cleveland administration and Lili'o Kalani to return her to her authority. But there's a big hiccup that comes up for whatever reason. There's an interesting story that comes out of the newspapers at that time in the United States where they're saying that, and there's huge fear. They were afraid that, in fact, the so-called revolutionaries, if you want to use that word, in Hawaii, were pushing for annexation, that because they had virtually illegally crossed the line as treasonous rebels to the Hawaiian Kingdom, that they would be punished as uh, for treason. And the punishment for treason in Hawaii, like the United States, of course, is to be executed. And this becomes an issue, like how dare Hawaiians execute white people? That becomes basically the fight. And Lili'u is kind of attacked by the Cleveland administration. Hey, and if we return you to power, you cannot punish these guys for treason. And she says, well, she has no authority to do that. She's limited by the Constitution, right? If they are treasonous, they need to face up to the courts. But anyway, make a long story short, this becomes politicized. The idea that they would hang, in fact, not even hang. In fact, the language was to chop off the heads of these white people. So that kind of becomes politicized. There's nothing in our history we ever chopped off anybody's heads, but that becomes the rhetoric. And so this idea of these brownies punishing white men for doing what is considered normal for white people at the world at that time as European colonizer histories are again going rampant around the world. And this becomes kind of a stumbling block. So eventually Lili'u says, okay, I promise not to, and as she says, she doesn't even have the power to, but she promises not to punish them for being treasonous. But by this time, Cleveland has kind of lost his power. He's kind of like the Biden, kind of going back to what happens with, they kind of lose their political influence and kind of a lame duck president for a while. Well, here comes McKinley. It's kind of like a Trump. Here comes McKinley, very into military expansionism. He's brought in, he's very much connected to the military, who wants to go out and secure lands and create an empire. And he's all for taking so called Hawaii. But it's very, very clear, as you'll see in fact in the readings, is that there's a huge debate going on in Congress on the legality of so-called taking Hawaii. Not just the legality, but the morality of taking another foreign state, especially a country that was a co-equal and had four so-called treaties up with the United States up until that time. So in this push to annex Hawaii again in 1897, Hawaiians organized and really led by the women, the Women's League of Aloha Aina, the Women's Society, Hui Aloha Aina, goes out and they organize the community and they create a petition drive, what's called the Ku-A petitions, the anti-annexation petitions, where they're roughly using two petitions, collect about 38,000 signatures saying that Hawaii does not want to be part of the United States. And it's very clear. I can see quotes here by James Collier. And you can see this image of a newspaper. This is actually from a San Francisco newspaper. Michelson, I think, who was a writer here in Hawaii at that time, showing how Hawaiians were organizing themselves, huge rallies and meetings, who were making it clear that Hawaiians did not want to be taken via annexation. And here are some quotes from Collier. Yeah, we the nation will never consent to the annexation of our lands until the very last patriot lives. That's why you hear the words hiki kaloha ina hopiloa. You hear people saying that to this day. Agreeing to annexation was like agreeing to be buried alive. Let us take up the honorable field of struggle, brain against brain, because the facts are very clear. He told the people, do not be afraid, be steadfast, and aloha for your land, and be united in thought, protest forever the annexation of Hawaii until the very last aloha aina lives. And these petitions are then taken and are in the formal attempt, and we kind of got to understand a little bit about, again, you should understand this, is that according to Article 2, Section 2 of the United States Constitution, in order for the United States to acquire extra territory, meaning territory outside of its territory limits, sovereign territory limits, there's what we create what's called a treaty making, right? A treaty is basically an agreement. It's a contract, basically, an international contract. And it's of the highest level of law, and that's because it has the highest scrutiny constitutionally. Not that it has to go through a long process, but the final affirmation, confirmation is whereby you have to have 2/3 of the United States Senate confirm and ratify the language, ratify a treaty. Well, there's an attempt to make this treaty. At first, it's kind of a very close, but eventually, as the debate goes on, it's very clear that the proponents of the annexation, they fail. They end up losing, and the Hawaiian Kingdom actually is victorious. Two major things. First is that they submit the Queen's actual protest letter on the floor, which describes the illegality and the unlawfulness of what the Senate was trying to do in regards to international law, because there is no mechanism for how the United States can just unilaterally take Hawaii, right? Unilaterally mean just one-sided. Um, and secondly, because of the petitions, it's very clear that Hawaii did not have the so-called consent of the governed, and so there was no legal basis for. And so the annexation in 1897 fails. Remember this. This is a fact. This is part of the mythology, the idea there is a treaty. So the question is always, well, by what, if the annexation failed, what would be the next so-called legal process? And what you find, there is none. So if there's no annexation, no treaty of annexation, there's no other legal, then what exactly is the language to describe the United States presence in Hawaii? And this is why you hear people to this day talk about the continued unlawful, belligerent military occupation of these islands, because that's the last legal uh, declaration or description of what the United States is in Hawaii. Now, we know that Hawaii cannot be a colony. It could have been a colony of the United States, and that's because it was never a territory of the United States. That Hawaii, in fact, is not just a territory. So you can look at places like Puerto Rico, right, which is a territory from Spain and then to the United States in 1898. But Hawaii was an independent nation state from 1843. I repeat, Hawaii was never a territory of the United States. Hawaii was a co-equal. So under international law, they're co-equals. And the argument, as you see in the readings, of course, is that if the United States can unilaterally take Hawaii, then under international law, Hawaii could unilaterally take the United States. Gee, the United States could just take Mexico. They can just take Canada. If you don't need the consent, or if you don't need a treaty, but this is the main argument. United States laws, the municipal United States congressional power is limited to the territory of the United States. I repeat, United States laws, right, are limited to territory of the United States, right? United States laws don't work in Japan. The United States cannot pass a law to work in Somalia, right? Each so-called country has sovereignty. Your laws are in your own land. So the question has always been, when did the United States laws? I want you to think about this question. When did it have any effect in Hawaii? In what year? When does it begin? And if it does have effect, how does it affect? What is its constitutional power based upon? Both nationally, U.S. constitutional law, and on the international law. And this is the enigma for Hawaii. Because what you find, there is none. There is no legal basis for how the United States can make claim to Hawaii. When the Treaty of Annexation failed, it was very clear that this is what they understood, even by the United States own representatives. Yeah. Copy of the Coup petition. So again, this is something you guys should already recognize. This is actually a great document that proves beyond a doubt that Hawaiian subjects had no intention of becoming part of the United States. And this is the record of the official protest. So, in other words, how do they gain if there is no? In fact, the question was put out by Congress. Well, if that's the case, why don't put it to a vote? Well, the pro-annexationists were like, no, we can't put this to a vote. If it's put to a vote, the people will overwhelmingly vote against annexation. In other words, the Democratic voice was very clear to be understood as being anti-annexation. And so in 1897, it fails because of the work of Hui Aina and Hui Kalai Aina and others. Yeah, so again, this is a fact. There is no treaty of annexation. As I offer all my students, I always tell them, if you can show me a copy of a treaty of annexation or treaty of cession between the United States and Hawaii, then you got an A for the rest of your career in Hawaiian studies. But I know there isn't. You see, this is the point. There is a mythology. In fact, you might look it up on the Wikipedia. And you might say, "Oh, yeah, Treaty of 18." But what you'll find is not a treaty. What you find is a resolution, and this is the point you need to really understand. Because they failed to the treaty following March in 1898, the United States was already, I repeat, already planning to have a war with Spain, what becomes the Spanish-American War. But in order to engage with Spain, they needed Hawaii. Hawaii becomes an important military space. Yeah, it's a launching for their war with Spain, so they could take Spanish territories. The Newlands Resolution is not a treaty. I repeat, it's a resolution. So look up first of all, what is the power of a resolution? A resolution is a public law, municipal law that's empowered where? Where does resolutions work? Where do United States resolutions work? Within their own territory. Well, how does a United States resolution? This is the question. How does the United States resolution have any effect extraterritorial, meaning outside of its territory? And if it doesn't, this is the question. If it doesn't, yeah, then whereby, how does the United States make claim to Hawaii? And if it does, if someone makes the argument it does, show the actual legal evidence. And what you find there isn't any. See, again, this is the point. Now, there's three-step process, right? So we always think about in annexation. First is the negotiations between the two, generally the two executive branches, and they come to an agreement. Second step, the most important step, is the ratification. Now you take what you sign and you go back to your Congress or your legislative process, and they ratify it. After it's ratified, now you got to make sure that your copy, yeah, country A and country B have the same treaty. And then it's exchange. On the exchange, which is the third step, this is when it's enforced. Now, in the Hawaiian kingdoms, it's very clear. It fails in the second step, and the third step never occurred in that there were never two copies that were exchanged, uh, and it was never based up because in order for the third step to occur, you have to have the second step, right? How can you exchange treaties if there is no treaty? So when people talk about the illegal treaty, I always say there isn't even an illegal one. There is no treaty. There's a resolution that was passed that people talk about as being a treaty. It is given the name of a treaty, but it's undoubtedly, again, I reiterate, undoubtedly a treaty, and those are facts. Even one of the important writers, Tom Kaufman, who used to write for the newspapers for many years, he had a couple of books. He actually has a book entitled Nation Within. And at first, it was actually, the subtitle was The History of the American Colonization of Hawaii. And then after he did the actual read,